I always thought my marriage was safe, unshakable, even. That was before the night everything changed. Before the shadows in my home began to feel heavier, and the air between us thickened with secrets I never saw coming. It started with a single look. One I wasn't supposed to notice. But once I did, I couldn't unsee it. My husband's best friend. The way his eyes lingered on me when he thought no one was watching. The tension I felt when we stood too close. I should have shut it down. I should have stepped back. But I didn't. And now I'm trapped in a storm I can't escape. I told myself it was harmless, just a fleeting moment, a glance that didn't mean anything. But the way Mark looked at me that night lingered. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't innocent. And worse, I liked it. I couldn't stop thinking about the way his eyes traveled down my body when he thought no one was looking, or how my skin tingled when his hand brushed against mine as he passed me the wine glass. "Everything okay?" my husband Eric asked, snapping me back to reality. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. But I felt Mark's gaze from across the room. Watching. Waiting. I should have ended it then. Instead, I found myself leaning into him. The stolen glances. The brief touches. The tension so thick I could barely breathe when we were in the same room. And when Eric left to run an errand, leaving Mark and me alone for the first time, I knew there was no going back. The silence stretched between us, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks as he stepped closer. "You know this is wrong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell me to leave," he said, his voice low and daring. I didn't. Instead, I let him move closer, and in that moment I knew. I was about to cross a line I could never uncross. Mark's eyes burned into mine, daring me to stop him. But I couldn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears as he stepped closer, his hand brushing my arm. Slow, deliberate, leaving heat in its wake. "You don't want me to leave," he murmured, his voice rough and low. I swallowed hard, my breath quickening. "This isn't right." "Then tell me to stop," he said again, his voice dripping with temptation. But I didn't. Instead, I let him close the distance, his hand sliding to my waist, pulling me against him. My breath hitched as his lips hovered over mine, so close I could feel the heat radiating off him. "We shouldn't," I whispered, even as my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch. "But you want to," he said, his voice thick with hunger. And before I could answer, his lips crashed into mine. The kiss was deep, urgent, and I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his hair as the tension between us finally broke. His hands roamed my body, leaving a trail of heat that made my knees weak. "This is dangerous," I gasped when his lips trailed down my neck. "I don't care," he growled against my skin, his grip tightening. "I need you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and every ounce of restraint I had left shattered. I let him take me, right there in my living room, on the couch where my husband and I sat just hours before. And as Mark's hands explored me, igniting a fire I couldn't put out, I knew I'd just made a mistake I could never take back. Mark's lips were everywhere, hungry, desperate, leaving trails of heat that made me forget everything but him. My breath came in short, shaky gasps as his hands explored my body, pulling me deeper into the moment. "This is wrong," I whispered, even as my fingers dug into his back, urging him closer. "Then stop me," he said, his voice rough, daring me again. I couldn't. His mouth claimed mine, harder this time, and the heat between us flared out of control. My body betrayed every thought screaming at me to stop, to pull away before it went too far. But it was already too late. Mark lifted me, carrying me to the couch, and I let him. My heart raced as he pressed me down, his weight pinning me in place. "You drive me crazy," he murmured against my skin, his breath hot and ragged. I gasped as his lips trailed lower, leaving me trembling beneath him. My thoughts spun wildly, guilt creeping in even as my body begged for more. "What if he finds out?" I managed to say, but my voice barely sounded like my own. "He won't," Mark growled, his hands sliding lower, igniting sparks that left me breathless. I knew I should stop him. I should push him away and end this before it destroyed everything. But instead, I gave in. I let him have me, right there in the living room, tangled in sheets and lies. And as the storm outside raged, so did we, reckless, dangerous, unstoppable. The aftermath was chaos. Our breaths ragged, clothes scattered, and my body still trembling from everything we'd done. Mark leaned back, his eyes locked on mine, dark and unreadable. "You're shaking," he said, brushing his fingers down my arm. "It's not from the cold," I whispered, my voice barely steady. I pulled the blanket around me, trying to cover my bare skin and the shame that was already creeping in. "We can't do this again," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew I didn't mean them. Mark smirked, leaning in until his lips brushed my ear. You don't believe that? I shivered, closing my eyes as his breath tickled my skin. He was right, I didn't believe it. The way my body responded to him, the way my pulse raced whenever he touched me, told me this wasn't over. Tell me you don't want more, he said, his hand sliding under the blanket, trailing over my thigh. I gasped, grabbing his wrist, but not to push him away. Instead, I held him there, my breath catching as the fire between us reignited. This is dangerous, I whispered, even as I leaned into him. I don't care, he growled, his lips finding mine again. Hungry, demanding. And just like before, I didn't stop him. I let the heat consume me all over again, ignoring the nagging voice in my head that warned me of the fallout waiting just beyond this moment. Because in his arms, nothing else mattered. I woke up tangled in the blanket, the scent of Mark still lingering on my skin. My heart raced as flashes of last night played in my mind, his hands, his lips, the way he made me feel alive and reckless. But reality hit fast. The front door creaked open. My stomach dropped. Babe! Eric's voice echoed through the house. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to grab my clothes, my hands shaking as I pulled them on. Mark was already up, buttoning his shirt, his eyes locked on mine. What do we do? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mark stepped closer, his fingers brushing my cheek. Stay calm, he said. I'll handle it. But I wasn't calm. My heart pounded so hard it hurt as Eric's footsteps drew closer. Hey Mark, Eric called out. Didn't expect to see you here this early. Mark smirked, stepping into the hallway before I could stop him. Thought I'd drop by and help with the shelves you mentioned. I peeked around the corner, my breath caught in my throat as Eric smiled, completely unaware. Man, I owe you one. Let me grab some coffee and we'll get started. Mark turned, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before he followed Eric into the kitchen. I sank onto the couch, my pulse still racing. We'd gotten away with it, for now. But as I listened to their voices in the other room, laughing like nothing had happened, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. I sat frozen on the couch, my pulse racing as their voices drifted in from the kitchen. Laughter. Casual conversation. As if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, my mind replaying the heat of Mark's touch, the way my body had betrayed me. And now he was laughing with my husband like he hadn't just had me in his arms hours ago. The clinking of coffee mugs snapped me out of my thoughts. I stood quickly, smoothing my clothes and forcing myself to breathe. You okay? Eric's voice startled me as he stepped into the living room, his eyes soft and filled with concern. Yeah, I said too quickly. Just tired. Mark walked in behind him, his gaze locking on mine for half a second. Just enough to send a shiver down my spine. Thanks for letting me crash here last night, Mark said smoothly, holding up his coffee like it was nothing. The roads were slick, and I figured it was safer than driving home. Eric nodded, completely buying it. Glad you stayed. You know you're always welcome here. The words hit harder than they should have, twisting the guilt inside me. I wanted to scream, to confess everything just to make it stop, but Mark's steady gaze kept me silent. As Eric turned back to the kitchen, Mark brushed past me, his fingers grazing my hip in a deliberate, dangerous move. Careful, he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. You're not done with me yet. I swallowed hard, my body betraying me again, aching for something I knew I couldn't have. But the worst part? He was right. The rest of the day dragged like torture. Mark and Eric worked side by side, laughing and swapping stories while I tried to keep my hands steady as I washed the dishes. But every time Mark looked at me, every lingering glance, every smirk, it felt like a spark igniting under my skin. And he knew it. Hey babe, Eric called from the garage. Can you grab us some more beers? Sure, I said, forcing a smile and wiping my hands on a towel. Mark followed me into the kitchen, closing the door behind us. The air shifted instantly. What are you doing? I hissed, backing against the counter as he stepped closer. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in, his hands trapping me against the counter. You can't tell me you didn't feel it, he murmured, his voice low and rough. Mark, stop. But even as I said it, my body betrayed me, leaning toward him instead of away. His lips brushed against my neck, and I shuddered. You're addicted to this, he whispered. I gasped, grabbing his arms, but instead of pushing him away, I held on to him, because he was right. This is insane, I whispered. And you love it. His lips captured mine and my resolve shattered. I kissed him back, hard and desperate, the risk only adding fuel to the fire. But then we froze. The garage door creaked open and Eric's voice called out, "Everything okay in there?" Mark stepped back, his lips curling into a smirk as he wiped his thumb across my swollen lip. "Yeah, just grabbing the beers," he called out, his voice steady. I forced a shaky breath, fixing my hair and smoothing my shirt before grabbing the bottles. Mark leaned in one last time, his voice low. "You can't stay away from me. And we both know it." I walked out with the beers, my hands trembling as Eric smiled at me like nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. And the worst part, I didn't want it to stop. Dinner that night was unbearable. Eric sat at the head of the table, laughing at Mark's jokes, completely oblivious to the tension simmering between us. I could barely eat, my stomach twisted in knots as Mark's knee brushed against mine under the table. It wasn't an accident. I shot him a warning look, but he just smirked, his eyes dark and full of promise. "Long day," Eric said, leaning back in his chair and stretching. "I think I'll head up early and get some rest." My heart dropped. "You're not staying up?" He shook his head. "Nah, I'm wiped." He turned to Mark. "You're crashing here again, right? Too late to drive now." Mark grinned. "If you don't mind." Eric clapped him on the back. "You're practically family." Family. The word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Eric kissed my forehead, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. "Good night, babe." I forced a smile. "Good night." As soon as he disappeared upstairs, the air in the room shifted. Mark leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on me. "You're shaking," he said, his voice low and teasing. I stood quickly, grabbing plates to avoid his gaze. "This has to stop, Mark." He followed me into the kitchen, stepping in behind me until I could feel his breath against my neck. "You don't want it to stop," he said, his hands sliding down my arms. I spun around, pushing him back. "This is dangerous. We'll get caught." "Then stop me," he challenged, stepping closer again. I opened my mouth to speak, but he silenced me with a kiss, deep and hungry. My resistance melted as his hands gripped my waist, lifting me onto the counter. "This is insane," I whispered as his lips trailed down my neck, leaving me breathless. "Then let it be insane," he growled, his hands sliding under my shirt. I couldn't fight it anymore. I didn't want to. And as I wrapped my legs around him, I knew we were past the point of no return. The next few minutes were a blur of heat and chaos. His hands were everywhere, and I couldn't seem to focus on anything except the fire building between us. Every touch, every kiss, felt like a drug I couldn't stop taking. I should have stopped him. I should have pushed him away before it got too far. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself giving in to the need, the want that I had been trying to ignore for days. His lips were on mine again, harder this time, more demanding. I moaned softly, the sound almost foreign to me, but I couldn't pull away. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with desire. "You know this can't stop now, right?" he said, his voice low, almost cruel. I swallowed, my hands trembling as I pushed his shirt off his shoulders. "We're going to ruin everything." "We already have," he murmured, kissing me again. I couldn't argue. I couldn't do anything except feel his touch, the way it set me on fire. In the distance, I heard a faint sound, Eric's voice coming from upstairs. My heart leapt into my throat. "Eric," I whispered, panic flooding through me. Mark pulled back, his gaze unwavering. "He's asleep. He won't hear a thing." I glanced toward the stairs, my stomach churning with guilt, but Mark's hands were already on me again. I couldn't fight him. I didn't want to. The door creaked open above us, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. But the footsteps were slow, deliberate. Eric was still upstairs, getting settled. And yet, the feeling of being caught, of risking everything, only made this feel more dangerous. "This is the last time," I whispered to myself, trying to steady my racing thoughts. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. And Mark knew it too. The end for now. Backhand index pointing right. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. What would you do if you were in her place? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for even more twists and forbidden desires.